Russia thought Pokrovsk would be a quick operation, a decisive strike capable of turning the war around. But the city is doing the exact opposite. It is tearing the Russian army apart from the inside. Only later, when we look back to the 26th of October, do we understand where it all began. In Gerasimov's triumphant announcement of an encirclement that never existed. Today, that promise has turned into an operational nightmare that is forcing Russia to drain Zaporizhzhia and Kherson in order to feed an offensive that has already gone too far. And the question now is simple. How long can Putin sustain this spiral before the entire front collapses? Gerasimov's announcement became the blind spot that shattered the entire Russian narrative. Because if Pokrovsk was already encircled, as he claimed on the 26th of October, then everything that happened afterward simply should not have happened. In that announcement, he declared that 31 Ukrainian battalions were isolated, supposedly trapped inside a complete Russian ring around the city. The map shown by Russia's own state media displayed a pincer closing from two directions, one axis pushing from the north, coming down from Novohrodivka, and another advancing from the Kurakovi area. In theory, it was a classic encirclement maneuver. Cut supply routes, press the flanks, and force a surrender. And it was no coincidence that the Kremlin chose Pokrovsk for that speech. The city is a critical logistical hub. From there, branch the routes that feed Ukraine's entire defensive network along the western axis of Donetsk. If Russia were to take Pokrovsk, it would gain direct access to roads that shorten a future push toward Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. In propaganda terms, it sounded like the turning point of the war. But when we look at the actual battlefield, that narrative collapses. The so-called encirclement never closed. Instead, what followed were weeks of heavy fighting, with Ukrainian battalions holding ground, repositioning units, and contesting every Russian advance. The images that surfaced later, drones filming constant explosions, Russian armor destroyed on the same stretch of road day after day, made it clear the operation wasn't progressing, it was bogging down. And this is where the story flips. Because while the announcement promised a quick capture, Pokrovsk began turning into the opposite. A slow, costly war of attrition riddled with tactical failures. What happens when an offensive planned to last only a few days begins consuming entire weeks of resources? It turns into exactly what Pokrovsk has become for Putin, a logistical and human black hole. And the evidence for this is not opinion, it is numbers. According to a report published by the Kyiv Post on the 12th of November, Russia lost more than 1,800 soldiers in just 5 days in the Pokrovsk area, along with dozens of armored vehicles, including T-72, B-3 tanks, BMP-2 infantry vehicles, and MTLB platforms repurposed as improvised transports. Aerial footage shows entire fields scarred with craters and burned-out Russian vehicle hulls, lined up like a trail of repeated failures. On the ground, Ukrainian teams filmed Russian columns being destroyed on the same road segments where they had already been hit days earlier, a clear sign that Moscow was repeating failed tactics purely due to political pressure to keep advancing. The expression used by military analysts sums up the situation well. Pokrovsk is costing Putin everything: tanks, vehicles, artillery, drones, ammunition, and above all, time and trained manpower, all being burned in a single city that returns no real strategic gains. And the deeper cost becomes clear when we look beyond the front line. Because to keep the assault alive, the Kremlin had to start draining other fronts. Reports confirm that in recent weeks, units originally stationed in Zaporizhzhia, where Russia is trying to contain Ukrainian advances toward Tokmak, were rushed to the Pokrovsk sector. The same happened in Kherson, a critical area because it protects the land corridor to Crimea. Maps show convoys changing direction, entire brigades being pulled from defensive positions that took months to build. This means Pokrovsk is not just local attrition, it is an act of strategic self-sabotage. Moscow is weakening precisely the points where Ukraine is applying the most pressure. And this is not just outside analysis. Even military trainers and recruiters, who should be far from the front, have been seen sent to Pokrovsk, reinforcing the sense that Russia's well of trained manpower is running dry. And this forced redeployment raises a question that is worrying the Kremlin. If Ukraine decides to exploit the very gaps left in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, does Moscow have any way to plug all the holes at the same time? Pokrovsk is exposing a problem Moscow has been trying to hide since the beginning of the year: the human exhaustion of its forces. According to the Atesh resistance movement, the situation has reached a point where new groups of soldiers are being sent to the front line without proper registration, without passing through formal mobilization centers, and without any integration into the units they are supposed to reinforce. This means many arrive at the front without knowing who their direct commander is, without understanding the brigade's procedures, and, in some cases, without even being listed in the official systems of the Russian armed forces. Videos shared by infiltrators show covered trucks carrying rushed recruits, some still with civilian backpacks, others wearing incomplete uniforms, a clear picture of improvisation. Atesh describes it as the definitive sign that the operational reserves have run out. When an army starts skipping basic steps, registration, preparation, integration, it reveals a level of exhaustion that goes far beyond material losses. The Kremlin is burning human capital at the same speed it burns armored vehicles in Pokrovsk. And this haste says more than any official briefing. Russia is not replacing soldiers, it is simply pushing bodies forward to plug holes. But the most shocking element appears when we look at a practice that has resurfaced in internal reports: the direct punishment of recruitment officers. According to Ukrainian sources and dissident Russians, heads of mobilization centers who fail to meet the targets imposed by the Kremlin are being sent to the front line as regular soldiers. With no updated training, no recent combat experience, and no physical preparation for frontline conditions, these officers are being dumped into extremely dangerous combat positions. Images show groups of recruits packed into storage buildings, many of them older or clearly assigned to roles they should never perform. And when the very officers responsible for the recruitment process begin appearing in those same lines, without proper vests, without standard helmets, the message becomes unmistakable. Russia is running out of people before it can even gain ground. This measure reflects a deep crisis. The Kremlin is punishing its own administrative staff to cover failures it created itself. It is a classic symptom of an army reaching its limit, and once this stage begins, battlefield effectiveness collapses. With the Kremlin throwing everything into Pokrovsk, it was inevitable that the board would start to open up, and Ukraine wasted no time exploiting those gaps. Because when you concentrate troops, ammunition, and armor in a single point, the entire line feels it, and it is exactly in those weaknesses that the Ukrainians have built their recent moves. Updated maps show something clear. Sectors that were once well defended in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson have thinned out. Russian units that provided backbone support in those axes disappeared overnight, and that absence created tactical corridors. With that, Ukraine began small but steady localized counterattacks, advances of 300, 500, or 700 meters that, added together, start pushing the Russian line backward. Ukrainian drones show infantry teams advancing in small groups, occupying abandoned trenches, and destroying machine gun positions that were previously well fortified. These moves are not random. They come from precise tactical intelligence, identifying exactly where Russia loosened its defenses to feed the Pokrovsk grinder. Every forced retreat, every position left unreinforced, becomes an opportunity for Ukraine to regain ground and further complicate the Kremlin's work. And while this unfolds at the edges, inside Pokrovsk, the story is different. It is pure resistance. The Ukrainian forces holding Pokrovsk have turned the city into a maze for Moscow's troops. The priority is clear: deny key buildings, especially tall structures that Russia could use as observation points. Footage from the urban line shows teams positioned inside reinforced buildings, installing barricades, acoustic sensors, and FPV drones prepared to intercept Russian armor trying to move in along the main avenues, short-range artillery, mortars, improvised systems, and even adapted kamikaze drones prevents Russia from establishing stable positions. And there is a crucial detail: the topography of Pokrovsk. The Russians need those elevated positions to direct fire and correct attacks. The Ukrainians know this, and that is why they maintain a rigid system to deny any advance on that type of terrain. The result? The city not only resists, it immobilizes the Russian advance and turns every block into unsustainable attrition. The battle for Pokrovsk is not just an operational disaster. It exposes a truth the Kremlin has been trying to cover for months. Russia's war effort is reaching its financial limit. According to independent analysts, Russia has already begun consuming its liquid reserves, including funds originally intended for economic stability. The central bank has been burning capital that should be protecting the ruble, supporting critical imports, and cushioning sanctions. And at the current pace, experts warn that Moscow has limited capacity to sustain a high-intensity conflict for much longer. Keeping constant offensives running requires money. A lot of money. Artillery, tank replacements, guided munitions, logistics, salaries, compensation payments. Every week of operations in Pokrovsk costs Russia something it cannot easily replace: real financial capital. The country tries to mask the situation with optimistic data, but the math is simple. When you spend more than you produce, the bill comes due. And Pokrovsk has accelerated that pressure. This depletion becomes even clearer when we analyze why Putin insists so much on this city. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the Kremlin sees a potential capture of Pokrovsk as a bargaining chip in future negotiations, an attempt to force some kind of territorial concession or project an image of strength. But there is a problem. Even if Russia manages to enter the city, the price paid will be so high that the victory becomes Pyrrhic. Human, material, and financial exhaustion turns any tactical gain into a strategic loss. And more, taking Pokrovsk does not guarantee control of the Donbass. It does not open natural corridors, it does not solve logistical problems, and it does not improve Russia's position on the most critical fronts. The reality is straightforward. Putin's strategy does not scale. He is sacrificing reserves, qualified personnel, and economic stability for a conquest that, in the most optimistic scenario, changes very little, and in the most realistic one, changes nothing. This operational and political myopia puts Russia on a path where every victory only deepens the defeat. Pokrovsk was supposed to be the quick victory the Kremlin promised. Instead, it became the full picture of Russia's failure. Propaganda that never materializes, catastrophic losses of men and armor, an exhausted army, and a strategy so desperate that it opened space for Ukraine to advance in the very sectors Moscow fears the most. The obsession with this city has turned Pokrovsk into a symbol of Putin's stubbornness, an offensive that, regardless of the final outcome, has already accelerated Russia's strategic defeat. And as the camera pulls back, revealing a graveyard of burned Russian tanks, the music rises, making one thing unmistakably clear. The bill for this war has come due. And if Pokrovsk has already exposed the scale of Russia's weakness on land, what happened in the Black Sea reveals an even deeper collapse, an attack that paralyzed one of Russia's most heavily protected ports and left its most advanced systems literally blind. If you want to understand how Ukraine managed to strike a target once considered untouchable and inflict billions in damage, click the video that is appearing on your screen. And do not forget to subscribe to The Military Ground. See you there.